The channel has been on a tear recently, covering a bunch of non-character breakdown videos, from the making of Fate's Three Houses trailers, comparisons, and exposing that game's somewhat numerous bugs and glitches. Today, we peel back the layers once again by now focusing on the development history of Fire Emblem Three Houses, who was involved, how mechanics and story features were conceived, and how everything was managed, as far as how much the developers of Koei Tecmo and Intelligent Systems were willing to reveal in interviews before and after the game's release. Be sure to hit like on this video before you click away. Also, if you haven't subscribed yet but you've been catching my last few videos, please consider subscribing before you go. Intelligent Systems and Koei Tecmo. Intelligent Systems started brainstorming ideas for the next Fire Emblem right after Fates had been released. The initial plan was to have it be a 3DS game, but its development was put on hold when Gaiden's remake came into the picture. As a result, actual work began only after Echoes had been completed and published, and it became consistent once it moved onto the Nintendo Switch around the mid-stages. Late 2019 was the estimated date the game would have to be finished at worst. However, the team calculated normal development would take far longer than expected, so they began looking for another studio whom they could outsource work to shorten production. Given Koei Tecmo was already developing Fire Emblem Warriors at the time, Intelligent Systems figured it was the ideal opportunity to ask the head of KT's Team Ninja, Yosuke Hayashi, to have Ko Shibusawa's team, the people behind the Dynasty Warriors series, support with development. Meanwhile, Nintendo oversaw the project's progress much like previous entries, checking the direction the game and gameplay was taking, and bringing suggestions every now and then. In particular, they were keen on having Three Houses capture the school setting as much as possible. As for how much content was considered, let's just say they got carried away with the collaboration. Koei Tecmo rounded up workers who were fans of the series, so the team was really motivated all throughout development. In the beginning, I was wondering what kind of pace they'd be able to keep. The Ko Shibusawa's team development skills are limitless. I actually got a little greedy there and went overboard on the size of the game. Yeah, we never intended to put this much stuff in the game. It's gotta be about twice as big as we set out to make. Staff and roles. The producers for Three Houses were Hitoshi Yamagami, just like Awakening and Fates, and Masahiro Higuchi. Genki Yokota reprised his role as director from Fates and shared this role with Toshiyuki Kusakihara. Chinatsu Kurahana was hired as the game's main character designer and worked along with Mao Yamanaka, who also provided the art for CG illustrations. The concept art, meanwhile, was handled by Kazuma Koda and Jun Suemi. Finally, Paul Petrascu, concept artist for Codename Steam, drew the introductory murals seen at the start of each of the game's months. Yuki Ikeno, Ryohei Hayashi, and Mari Okamoto from Koei Tecmo were in charge of the game's scenario and writing. Takeru Kanazaki, Hiroki Morishita, and Rei Kondo returned from Fates to work on the music. Studio Sanzigen handled the animated cutscenes for the game, while the others were done in-house using the game's engine. Of course, at the end, most of the work ended up being handled by KT themselves. Programming, gameplay, online features, and so on. As per Kasakihara's words, Intelligent Systems only provided a small crew compared to KT's staff. Intelligent Systems would later check the staff's progress around 2 to 3 times a month. The title. Three Houses' title was decided in its final stages of development, though it differs quite a bit between languages. In Japan, the game went with Wind, Flower, Snow, Moon, a Chinese idiom, with the intention of representing the 4 main characters of the game: Byleth, and the leaders of the Three Houses. Incidentally, it would also represent the passing of the 4 seasons, which fit the narrative given Part 1 takes place during a full year. Meanwhile, the Three Houses subtitle ended up being chosen everywhere else for self-explanatory reasons. Officers Academy, Part 2, and Multiple Routes. Both the Academy motif and teaching features started, believe it or not, as something of a joke, as the team bantered, before it took a concrete shape with the involvement of KT and the Three Kingdoms motif. As for the Officers Academy, it was chosen thanks to Fire Emblem genealogy of the Holy War. The devs took note of how the characters of Sigurd, Quan, and Eldigan in that game all graduated from one, and how it would be interesting to explore aspects of such academies in-game. This way, the narrative would take its time to explore everyone's relationships and friendships before having a war break through and have them reunite as enemies for drama's sake. FE4 also influenced the game being split into 2 acts, but with the distinction that, unlike that entry, all students would have grown up and matured once Part 2 happened. As for the branching paths, they were considered at the start of the planning stages under the idea that having the story always play out the same for everyone would be boring. From the titular Three Houses, only Black Eagles was chosen to have 2 routes, mostly because Edelgard's role with the plot was deemed unique and interesting enough to allow it. And from those two, Silver Snow was intended to be the hardest route of the game, mostly as a side effect of losing one of the player's main characters. Crimson Flower itself was also meant to be properly hidden and harder to access at first. KT's devs even explained about being railroaded into Silver Snow, because the game didn't even telegraph an exploration event could lead to an actual route split. In the end, the event which opens the branching paths was given an easy requirement to fulfill, and Kasakihara himself estimates path became 3 times more accessible than initially envisioned. The Three Nations' design. The Adrestian Empire was designed by mixing Italy's culture with German-named areas. The Holy Kingdom of Fargus took a Northern European inspiration that went in-universe, from the old Gaul-looking place, into a more traditional European style akin to the Frankish Empire. Meanwhile, the Leicester Alliance inherited a mix of both areas. As in-universe, they take pride in having separated themselves from Fargus while trying to imitate the style of Adrestia's nobility, leading to more stylish designs. Crests. Crests came to be also as an inspiration from FE4, in particular trying to invoke how there's certain bloodlines which provide actual power that, while valued, wouldn't be inherited by everybody. Plus, the concept would facilitate multiple opportunities for drama and character angst. Tea parties. The whole idea of tea breaks between Byleth and a student of their choice came up during mid-development, as each character would prefer specific beverages, and clues pointing out their preferences were added in each of their profiles. Skill tutoring. Three Houses going for a skill tutoring system rather than just having multiple levels of weapon proficiency was inspired by Zil-Ol, one of Koei Tecmo's RPG series, with some of the names used for some classes being borrowed directly from that franchise. The Dining Hall. The various kinds of dishes available in the dining hall were influenced after the Age of Discovery, a time period in which many European ships sailed the seas looking for new trading routes, while also adding a fantasy flair over them. Climate and culture for each region was also considered for determining which kind of dishes a certain group of people would enjoy the most, and since Fodlan's Magic have had far more progress than standard technology, things like ice cream were considered feasible enough for the game's era. Part 1 Paintings. The animated paintings seen at the start of each month were inspired by both Eastern Europe's art style and by Fire Emblem Echoes' monologue seen at the start of the game. There was a clear intent in having the player appreciate the world's history and the passing of seasons. Also, the paintings weren't always animated. In fact, that addition was made at the very last minute of development. Story. Due to working with Shibusawa's team, the game's world building took inspiration from The Romance of the Three Kingdoms, a historical novel from East Asia. The focus would be on having 3 different nations coexist with relative peace before a war would break out and turn them into enemies. From those 3, the Empire was given the role of kickstarting the war due to 1. The team following the franchise's traditions, and 2. The concept of an empire already having negative connotations. Kasakihara came up with only one of the game's stories, Silver Snow. It would revolve around facing Edelgard, Byleth's chosen house leader, as their opponent. From there, his route was used by KT as the foundation for the other 3, all while supervising the staff and making sure they kept a Fire Emblem feel. Edelgard and Dimitri's stories, meanwhile, were conceived with the deliberate intent of having them being polar opposites. As a result, Crimson Flower's theme was chosen to be one of military rule, end quote, and seeking one's convictions up until the end, even if it meant opposing those you once cared about. By contrast, Azure Moon's theme would be one of turmoil, seeking out what true righteousness is, and eventually achieving the righteous government, end quote. Lastly, Verdant Wind's story began with the idea of Claude's learning to fight against xenophobic mindsets for the sake of his homeland. The story structure was also tinkered so it could change based on various factors, intending to have players discuss their experiences with one another and be surprised over how strikingly different their experiences could be. This not only would affect the main story though, as even the more smaller choices, both in plot and monastery, could potentially impact character interactions. There was a clear focus on world building as well. Not only did Kasakihara do his own research on religion, he also wrote up Fodlan's entire history, which was later used as reference materials for development, regardless if not everything would end up being used. From then on, the developers from Koei Tecmo would do the rest, research tropes used in previous entries, and propose the ideas to intelligent systems. Their work came to the extent that Kasakihara himself believes no one from the crew can claim to truly understand everything going on with the game. There was also keen attention in leaving empty gaps in the story and lore with the purpose of communicating how huge the scope of the game's world is. Lastly, there was a clear attempt with all of the routes to avoid delivering what the fanbase refers to as a golden ending. If we had created a route for Three Houses like Revelation was to Fates, that route would have definitely ended up being perceived as the correct route. In Three Houses, each route has its own history, and we wanted players to be able to decide for themselves. The leaders of the Three Houses have their own unwavering beliefs and worldviews that are unique to themselves. We wanted to model the story and its themes after a dilemma that was grounded in reality, so from the beginning, there were never any plans to make something like Revelation. Characters. Characters in general were conceived as rough drafts that were later expanded upon. Take, for instance, Mercedes' background. She bears a crest of a family that no longer exists. That kind of thing. From there, we could expand upon and flesh out other concepts like her older brother, Emil. Following that process would lead to how things ended up looking in the final product. Each student was meant to serve as a microcosm of the place they came from, while also having each house follow a specific theme. In the case of the Black Eagles, their main theme was challenging backgrounds, and would represent an empire that had long since been in decline after their golden age. With the Blue Lions, they would convey a more traditional cast of characters, given their kingdom would contain many knights in their ranks. The Golden Deer, meanwhile, they were initially meant to reflect how the Alliance accomplished nothing due to their members being at each other's throats, rather than becoming the good kids seen in the final product. For the Ashen Wolves, they were more or less themed after Japanese delinquents, composed from people from Abyss. Kasakihara wanted the player to easily empathize with Byleth as a player's surrogate, and not much more thought was placed in their design. Essentially, Byleth was meant to be a blank slate that the player could superimpose not only themselves onto, but their lacking knowledge of the world as well. Edelgard was given the role of both Emperor and, most of the time, antagonist for the sake of toying with the player's expectation about what's usually expected from these roles. There was also a clear intent in her character being both endearing and relentless, as per their words. Lastly, her Crest of Flames came due to being conceived as Byleth's opponent for Silver Snow. There were also ideas it would have allowed her to mess up with Divine Pulses, but they were never implemented. Dimitri having an eye patch during part 2 of most routes came to be during development, mostly as a desire to have each character's part 2 design ooze the kind of life they've been going through. Similarly, this also was the reason why he doesn't have it in Crimson Flower, as it would help express the meaning behind the eye patch. Claude was initially intended to be far shadier morality-wise before this aspect of him was toned down during development. Khalid was also his actual name, and there were plans to reveal this inverted wind via Nadir, calling him such midway through the story, but it never came to be due to the team having issues with finding an ideal place for the scene. DLC. The developers had the clear idea of bringing back concepts they had been forced to cut in the base game. In a sense, they saw it as less retrofitting content and more like expanding the setting and making use of foreshadowing that had been already laid out at the game's launch, citing the Abyss, its underground library, and Byleth's mother as examples of this. Meanwhile, prior to the game's release, its official page announced it would be getting 4 waves of DLC, which would include both free and paid content. Yokota soon after stated in an interview that any new additional episodes the game would get this way would be unrelated to both the main story and post-game, and that the game's maddening difficulty would become available later with a free update. A guide provided by Famitsu for the game later on would go into more specifics about what to expect down the road for Waves 3 and 4, such as the addition of Yuritsa, Anna, and the Ashen Wolves as new playable characters, the latter crew exclusive to the expansion pass. Costumes! Extra costumes happened mostly as a way to provide players content while Wave 4 was in the works. Interestingly, the servants' costumes, as in the maid and butler outfits, were initially conceived for the Knights of Saros only, but they ended up being available only for the students instead. The sauna. As mentioned in the previous video, the sauna was considered to be in the base game, but ended up being saved for DLC. Via Nintendo Dream, it's revealed this was because the team wasn't fully satisfied with what they had back then. Specifically, as baths used to be separated per gender. This initially meant that Byleth was restricted with what characters they could share the feature with. Assets for naked characters didn't exist either, and the team didn't want their intention with the feature to be misinterpreted. Then, prior to the game's release, Kasakihara proposed having characters wear their clothes in the sauna while playing a minigame. The general feature began building up from there. Feeding dogs and cats. The feature was added by request of Nintendo's overseas branches wanting the option to play with the pets. The developers did try to implement the idea on their own at first before giving up, so Nintendo's suggestion pushed them to give it another shot. Extra classes. The main 4 DLC classes were added with the intention of covering as many bases as possible and as a direct callback to Awakening, which by itself was expected to generate buzz. More save slots. The addition of having up to 25 save files came up as a proposal from Koei Tecmo, as the expected players would want to preserve some of their favorite moments. Kasakihara also admitted that they're considering having this amount of slots for future entries. Cindered Shadows. As development of the main game wrapped up, the team considered introducing a 4th house via expansion pass, which would later become the Ashen Wolves. They would be, in a way, one of the few examples of proper retrofitted content that took full advantage of the game's DLC missions, given their starring role in it. When it came time to choose what other characters would get to appear in it, they were clear on whom they wanted to be. Well, we wanted the leaders of the 3 main houses to be present, so we started from there. After that, we chose one person from each house. We also considered characters with a specific skill from a strategic point of view. We narrowed it down more to the characters whose skills felt right to include. Later, we decided which characters would have some kind of relation to the characters that would appear in the side story. Linhardt, in particular, can talk at length about crests, so we felt he could play an important role in the events of the story. As for Ash, he could relate pretty heavily to having to live somewhere else like the Abyss, so we felt that, because of that, he could help expand the story. The main reason the side story was chosen to be unrelated to the main plot and follow a more traditional formula, akin to the previous entries, was for the sake of spicing things up. Being able to carry over your progress for the main story was planned at some point, but there were worries it could make the side story either a breeze or a huge challenge. Removing the ability to gain levels was similarly considered, but ended up being scrapped. As far as the story is concerned, it's interesting that, despite Cindered Shadows taking place in its own universe, given none of the Ashen Wolves recognized Byleth at the start of the main game, May 2020's Nintendo Dream interview confirms that the events do canonically happen prior to the game's main story, and that what's seen in Cindered Shadows is how things would have played out with Byleth's involvement. Incidentally, the reason the character of Aelfric was made a cardinal of the church was because the team wanted to expand the underutilized concepts from the base game. The cardinals, for example, are briefly mentioned by Tomas once, and a few are fought only in Silver Snow's endgame. The focus on crests that go normally unused, outside of New Game Plus's crest items, was also done for this reason. That will wrap things up for this week's Fire Emblem video. One of the things that stuck out to me is the very clear care Koei Tecmo had for their game. They took on the challenge to develop 3 houses, and it seems they did their absolute best with the game. It's easy to look at the final product and comment on the performance issues or the rushed nature of the story, but this video reminded me that the Koei Tecmo devs are gamers and love the series regardless. I want to give a big thanks to everyone who recently subscribed as well. If you are still watching and you're unsubscribed, please consider doing so. I'm working hard towards the ultimate 100,000 subscriber goal for the channel, and your simple contribution helps to get it there. Lastly, I want to give a thank you to my patrons, Melissa Farmer and Adelaide, and especially my $40 patrons, Furmuzzle, Michael Taylor, Prime Fusion, Sleepy Sky, Artorius, and Stephen Rupp. If you want to support me through Patreon, please check the link below. We're a small community, but we'd like to have fun. Deuces.
You